Hello everyone and welcome to chapter 22 part 2 video. Again, we're talking about performance measurement and responsibility accounting. And in part 1 of this video series, we talked about what is segments or pieces of the business as opposed to the whole. And we talked about the 3 types of responsibility centers, which are cost centers, profit centers, investment centers. Now, in this video, we're going to talk about how these centers are evaluated. We're going to talk about the concept of controllable versus uncontrollable costs. And again, the thing that I want to make sure that you pay attention to throughout this entire chapter is how does responsibility accounting help us to make decisions? So, as we discussed in the last video, responsibility accounting is accounting for the segments of a business, and it tells us how each department is contributing to the revenues and expenses of the company as a whole. And this helps us to measure the performance of each department so we can evaluate the managers, see how they're doing. Are they doing well? You get promoted. If you're not doing so well, you get the boot or something along those lines. Now, I want to relate this back to a previous concept that we learned in this class, which is the budgetary control process. Okay? And that control process we learned starts first with setting a plan. We set what the budget should be or our expectation, what it should be. Then we monitor how the business is doing, meaning we gather the actual data of how they're doing. Then we get into the control phase, which is comparing the budget to the actual that's happening. Then we use that information as feedback to make changes and improve. So if something is going well, we're going to learn from it. We're going to keep doing it. We're going to have other departments do the same thing. If something isn't going so well, we need to change it. Okay? And then from there, we set a new plan, and then the cycle goes around and around and around. Okay? And responsibility accounting helps us in this way because what it does is it's the same concept, but of a budget for the business as a whole, but it's broken down by department, meaning we set a budget for each individual department. We monitor the behavior or the actual data from each individual department, and then we can compare budget to actual to make changes and improve, and we do that on a department level. So not the company as a whole, but on a department level. But something, so therefore, if this is about evaluating performance and seeing how companies are doing, what exactly are we evaluating them on? Well, that is going to be different for each type of responsibility center, okay? Because we want to make sure that they are being evaluated based on what they are responsible for. So, for example, let's take cost centers. We talked about how cost centers are not responsible for selling anything. They incur costs, right? So, for example, I gave you the example of the accounting department, right? The accounting department incurs costs. They've got the cost of their employees, they've got the cost of their supplies, they have depreciation on the computers that they're using, the office furniture they're using, all that stuff, but they don't actually sell anything. So, therefore, they should not be evaluated on the costs of or the revenues or the sales of the business because they're not responsible for that at all. Instead, if they're responsible for costs, they should be evaluated based on are they able to control those costs? Okay, are we spending too much in the accounting department, or are they staying within their budget? Okay, a profit center, on the other hand, so that might be like an individual target store. Well, they're going to be responsible for generating income. And income, like we talked about, is both revenues minus expenses. So we want to evaluate them on both of those things. Are they selling well, which is revenues? And are they also controlling their costs? So they do both revenues and costs. Okay? And then there's the investment centers. Okay? Now, investment centers are responsible for not just income, which is revenues minus costs or expenses, but they're also responsible for making investment decisions, meaning what assets are we going to use to generate that income? How many stores are we going to have? Do we need to close some stores? Do we need to open new stores? Things along those lines. So it's not just simply are we making money, it's how are we using our assets to make money. So that's what they're going to be evaluated on, is their use of assets to generate income. And we're going to talk later on in this class about specific calculations and things that we look at to figure out how they're using their assets to generate income. Okay, I just want you guys to understand that for each of these different centers, because they're responsible for different things, they're going to be evaluated differently, and we want to match their evaluation measures with what they're responsible for. Okay, don't evaluate them based on something they have no control over. Okay. But in addition, I want to share another concept with you related to performance evaluations, and this concept that managers should be evaluated based on only what they control. Well, that's the difference between the concept of uncontrollable costs versus controllable costs. Okay, so certain costs you can control and certain costs you can't. And we want to make sure that in our performance evaluations, we only evaluate people based on the costs that they can control, not what they can't control. It's not fair to evaluate them based on something they can't control. So let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. So we talked earlier in the previous lecture about Target having maybe a West Coast manager that's responsible for all of the different Target stores on the West Coast. Okay? Now, the West Coast manager, let's say, is responsible for negotiating the store rent. So when they decide to open a new store, the West Coast manager negotiates with the landlord on how much the rent is going to be. The actual store manager does not do that negotiation. In fact, the West Coast manager probably negotiates the store rent first, secures the location, before they even hire the store manager. So the store manager isn't even there when they make that negotiation. However, the store manager is responsible for hiring and scheduling the employees in their specific store. So when it comes time to evaluate the Mission Viejo store manager, for example, and we're looking at the income statement for the Mission Viejo store, well, they're going to have sales minus expenses. And again, this is the partial income statement. It's not the whole thing. I don't have room or time to explain the whole income statement. I just want to give you an example of what we're talking about here. But if you were looking at their income statement, they would have sales minus expenses, and we'd be listing out all the different expenses. Well, the Mission Viejo store manager is responsible for the sales of that store. The Mission Viejo store manager is going to do everything they can to try to sell the product the best they can. So in other words, that means they're going to be responsible for making sure that the shelves look clean and neat and tidy so that when customers come in, they can find what they need easily. The Mission Viejo store manager is going to be responsible for merchandising, meaning to make sure that everything is displayed in a nice way to make it attractive to customers. The Mission Viejo store manager is going to be responsible for making sure that the store's shelves are full. So they're going to be responsible for ordering more inventory, for managing the inventory in the store. And if something is getting low, they're going to order more. So in that way, the Mission Viejo store manager is definitely responsible for the sales of their store. And now what about wages? Are they responsible for the wage expense of their store? Well, yes, they are. Because I said here that the store managers are responsible for hiring and scheduling their employees. So the store manager determines how many employees they're going to have. The store manager is going to determine how many employees to have on each shift. On the busy shifts, we're going to have more employees. On the slower shifts, we're going to have less employees. They are responsible for all those things. Now, the Mission Viejo store also has rent expense. But should the Mission Viejo store manager have rent expense included as part of their evaluation? I mean, it definitely needs to be here on the income statement, right? Because it's part of the cost of running the store. But is it fair for the Mission Viejo store manager to be responsible for the rent expense? Well, no, it's not. Because that is out of their control. Because who controls what the rent expense is? The West Coast manager, right? The West Coast manager was the one who negotiated the rent on that store. So the store manager of Mission Viejo should not be responsible for that. So in that case, wages would be a controllable cost for the Mission Viejo store manager, but rent would be an uncontrollable cost, meaning what they are not responsible for because somebody else negotiated that. Okay, so that is something to keep in mind when you're doing these performance evaluations is we only want to evaluate people based on what they have control over, not what they don't have control over, because that's not fair. Um, So, sorry, let me go back to our topics covered. So now we have covered, I think, all of these things. We talked about what responsibility accounting is. We've talked about the 3 types of responsibility centers. We talked about how each one is evaluated based on what they are responsible for. And we want to only consider the controllable costs, not the uncontrollable costs when we evaluate them. And ultimately, like we said, responsibility accounting helps businesses to make decisions because it helps them to see how each department is doing so that then they can make decisions to either promote or learn from departments or segments that are doing well. And they will also see the segments that are not doing well so that they can make the changes that they need to make to improve those areas. All right, that's all I have for now. I hope this information is helpful to you. It should hopefully help you on the quiz that we're going to have in class. And we're going to learn more about the specifics of responsibility accounting, getting into the numbers and the calculations more throughout the class.